The next way that we're going to solve some quadratic equations is using the square root property. So the square root property is pretty simple. The only thing you got to do is get the equation to look a certain way, right? So for example, we wanted to end up looking something like this: x squared equals 2, let's say 25. So in this case, there is no b, uh, and you don't need to be in standard form. So not in standard form. No, we do not need to make it equal to 0. Okay, so in fact, what you want to do is get the x squared by itself, right? Get the x squared by itself. So in this case, it's already by itself, right? So there is no b term. There's no bx. So this would be perfect. And then all we got to do is take the square root of both sides. So square root here and square root there. So x is equal to. And whenever you take the square root, there's going to be two answers: the plus and the minus. Sorry, plus or minus in this case 5. Right. So the square root property says if x squared is equal to some letter, some number k, then the answers for x are equal to positive square root of k and the negative square root of k. So in this case, this previous example, it was plus square root of 25, which is positive 5, and then the negative square root of 25, which is positive 5. Okay. So now if k is greater than 0, then you're going to have some real solutions. But if k is not equal to 0, or is not greater than 0, if it's actually negative, then you're going to have some pure imaginary answers. Okay, so for example, let's see, same number actually. Let's try that. Let's say x squared is equal to negative 25. So for the square root property, the only thing you got to do is get the x squared by itself, so it's by itself, and then take the square root of both sides. So when I take the square root of x squared, I just get x, and that's going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 25. But remember, we can take that negative out, so it'll be plus or minus the I times the square root of 25. So 25 square root of 25 is 5, so it'll be plus or minus 5i. That's going to be the answer for x. So that means it's either 5i or negative 5i. Two choices, right? Okay, here's another example. Let's say x squared minus 17 equals to 0. So again, here you don't have a b term, bx. So all I need to do is get this 17 over to the other side. Plus 17 on both sides. So x squared is equal to 17. Then uh, since there is no b term, x squared is by itself, I can take the square root of both sides. So x equals 2, the positive square root of 17, or the negative square root of 17. And the square root of 17, it's some kind of decimal, we don't know. So we'll just leave it as that. So it's plus or minus. All right, sometimes we might not see it as just x by itself, but it's something squared. So for example, x minus 4, all of it squared, equals to 12, right? So this is something squared, right? Something to the second power, right? Something to the second power. So how do I get rid of that second power? Again, I take the square root of both sides. Now here, this will cancel out the square root will cancel out the 2. So you're going to have x minus 4 is equal to, here it's still plus or minus the square root of 12. I'm going to add 4. So x is equal to, when I add 4 here, I can put it in the front. You can put it in the back, but it's just probably better to put it in the front. So it looks like this: 4 plus or minus the square root of 12. And one thing about the square root of 12 is that it can be simplified. So remember our perfect squares: 1, 4, 9. Well, 4 is the one that can divide it, right? So it's going to be 4 plus or minus the square root of 4 times 3. But this 4 can pop out. So it'll be 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 3. So those would be your two answers there. Okay. Let's see, what other type of equation might come out? I can do another one of those. Okay, let's see. Okay, so for example, let's try another one. Let's say 5x minus 3 squared equals 2. Let's say negative 3. So again, this on the left side is something squared. Something squared, right? So in order to get rid of it, and in order to get rid of this squared, I need to take the square root of both sides. Now, on the left side, it's just going to be 5x minus 3 equals 2, plus or minus. I got this negative 3, so I can get ahead of the game and say, well, this is going to be I square root of 3. So I square root of 3. That negative's gone. Now I got to solve for x. I got 5x minus 3. I want to know what this is by itself. So this is a linear equation. I got to add 3 to both sides. So it's going to be, this 3 can stay in the front. 3 plus or minus I square root of 3. So this is gone. And this is just 5x. And then I just got to divide by 5. That'll give the x by itself. All of this gets divided by 5. And that would be my final answer. So what does this mean? This means two things, right? Two answers. The first one is 3 plus I times the square root of 3 divided by 5. That's the first one. And the second was the minus. 3 minus I square root of 3 divided by 5. So those are my two answers. Those are my two answers. This one and this one. Right? Which are in they're in there. They're both in there because this gives you two choices, right? So two paths to take. Okay. So again, it was squared. I took the square root. I noticed this was a negative inside, so I made it I squared root of 3. And anytime you take the square root of a number, there's two answers. So you always have to do this plus, right, or minus. So this is where this plus or minus comes from. So anytime I take the square root of a number, the answer is plus or minus that. Right, plus or minus. Because, well, I should have started right with 7, right? It's equal to x squared, actually. Let's say it was this. Let's start at that one again. Let's say it's x squared equals to 7. So you're always gonna have something like this squared. If you can get something by itself that is being squared, that's when you take the square root, right? And again, when you take the square root, it's plus or minus that number, plus or minus. So if I go back and I say negative square root of 7 times negative square root of 7, the negatives cancel. And then square root of 7 times square root of 7 is just 7. And then if it's positive square root of 7 times positive square root of 7, then positive times positive is still positive. And then square root of 7 times square root of 7 is 7. So those two choices, the negative square root of 7 and the positive square root of 7, if I square them, If I square them, they're both going to give me 7. And that's what we're saying at the very beginning. So that is the square root property, because all you're doing is taking the square root of both sides. That's why we call it the square root property. And so how do you use it, or when do you use it? Whenever you have something squared, right, equals whatever. Doesn't matter what the other part is on the right side. So as long as something is being squared, right, then you can use the square root property. And we saw some examples where it wasn't just x squared. So you could use the square root property here. You could also use it here, something like this, right? Because it's, as long as it's something being squared, something to the second power, that's when you use the square root property. You take the square root. So x equals 2 plus or minus square root of 7. Over here, square root, x minus 2 equals 2 plus or minus 2, because the square root of 4 is 2. And it could be positive 2 or it could be negative 2. And then I can add 2. You could put it in the back, right, like that. But it's really the same thing. It's plus 2, positive 2 plus 2, 4. Or negative 2 plus 2, 0. So they would both work in this case. And then you can plug them back in, see if they work. If I plug in 4 minus 2, right, the original question was x minus 2 squared equals 4. If I plug in 4, I get 4 minus 2 is 2 squared. That's 4, yes. If I plug in 0, it'll be 0 minus 2, that's negative 2. And then that is squared. Does it give me 4? Yes. So they both work, right? So this is the square root property, because you take the square root of both sides. And sometimes when it's something more like this, x minus 2, when it's something parentheses x, or let's say 2x minus 3 squared equals 7, something like this, there's going to be more work to be done, because you got to take the square root, and that'll give you the insides by itself, equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 7. But then you got to add 3, right? You can put 3 in the front. And then once you do that, then you still got to divide by 2. Divide by 2. And then from here, you can split it up into your two parts. 3 plus the square root of 7 divided by 2. 3 minus the square root of 7 divided by 2. So don't forget that. If it's so if this inside is a little bit more involved, there's going to be more steps. And if you see a negative on this side, don't forget that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So something like the square root of negative 3 can be rewritten as I square root of 3. Any chance you get to do that, you need to take it. Anytime you see this, you need to do it. Do not leave it as a negative square root of 3. Change it, okay?